All right, welcome to episode 14 of Researching Happy. My name's Matt Icello, and this is the podcast all about the research world of happiness and well-being. So today we're going to take a bit of a different tact. It's something that I've been talking about wanting to do since the very beginning, which is to really go broader than, the field of psychology. And we've already done that a little bit in other fields, but today we're going to theology. And we're talking with Dr. Brendan Case from Harvard University and the Human Flourishing Program that they have there. So this is going to be new for some people. I'm always interested in feedback, but this week I'm really, really interested in feedback. Let me hear what you think. I think Brendan, we have a really, really great conversation. I hope that people can see the link to happiness as we go along. You know, we really do talk a lot about theology, but I think Brendan brings up a really interesting point, which is that, psychology and for us, I guess, positive psychology is at its worst when it's naive to the rich discussions that have been had around, what it means to live a good life, that have been had, across philosophy, but also theology in the last 2,000 and more years. So I think often, people are quarreling about things that have actually long been discussed and long been settled in some ways. And, I think for us to progress the pace of the academic process, we should know about that. So, as always, I'm really, really keen to get feedback on this one. I've got a few more scheduled with this kind of topic in mind, but always open to more ideas around other fields that we think have weigh in some way on happiness and well-being. So you can support the show at Locals. There's a link below in the show notes. Support can start from $5 a month. That's greatly appreciated. But more than that, I guess, even the easy stuff, which is sharing, liking, rating the show. Particularly this one, I think as we talk theology, you might have a person in mind who might really be interested in some of the topics that are discussed today. So please let me know what you think. Share this episode around, and thank you and enjoy. Okay, so welcome back to Researching Happy. We are honored, I guess, to have Dr. Brendan Case on the show today. Hi, Brendan.
Hi, Matt. I'm honored by the invitation. Good to be with you.
Yeah, look, I appreciate that. I've got a quick bio for you, just as a quick introduction, but I'll skip through this quickly and we can get started. So, Brendan Case, THD, the first THD we've had on the show. Really the first time I've ever actually seen THD, to be honest with you. I didn't know that it was a concept, but is the Associate Director of Research at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. He works to both develop integrative research strategies that draw together explorations of human flourishing from across the social sciences and humanities, and to disseminate the program's work through external partnerships and public events. Dr. Case's work has also appeared in journals such as Modern Theology, Studies in Christian Ethics, Franciscan Studies, and Pro Ecclesia. His works in progress include the long-term project to develop a theological account of love that brings fundamental Christian convictions into conversation with classic debates in moral philosophy and contemporary debates in the social and behavioral sciences. So welcome, Brendan.
Thank you. Yeah.
So it'd be great just to kick off and just tell us about yourself. So how have you come to be in the role and the field that you're in?
Sure. Well, I'm an academic, like you and like many of your listeners presumably. So it's not as interesting a story as it might be with some other guests. It involves me sitting in rooms in various universities for a long time. But I mean, essentially, I like a lot of people who are humanistically inclined in college, it kind of came down for me to law school or grad school of some sort, and I realized that I really only was interested in the law and constitutional law and teaching, and I thought, well, if I just want to be a university professor, might as well just not take on the debt, and go into the humanities straight, and so anyway, I was interested. I'm a I'm a Christian myself, and I was pretty involved in my faith tradition from a young age, and so had interests in theology as a discipline that sort of drew me towards that field of specialization, which is what I did a master's and doctorate in it at Duke University, and then found my way here to the Human Flourishing Program relatively quickly. I did a postdoc at Baylor, and through in hindsight, just incredibly serendipitous series of events that unfolded as the COVID pandemic was shutting everything down in the spring of 2020, and things were becoming increasingly grim, especially for academics on the job market. Ended up getting this being hired in this role as associate director for research here at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, as you mentioned, and that was it's a dream come true in a lot of ways, but particularly I think as given the dominant trends in the academy, really across the academy, towards specialization, ever increasing specialization within knowing more and more about less and less, essentially, in any given field. It was a relief for me as a kind of inveterate generalist with interest in lots of areas, and I've always sort of been a reader in many fields beyond my own narrow area of specialization. To come into a role where there was a sort of strong expectation that I in particular, but really all of us in the program, would work in a pretty Catholic way, kind of across a lot of disciplines, and have be expected to cultivate interests in our colleagues' work and work in this very robustly interdisciplinary way.
And I guess the nuance there is, by Catholic way, you mean like universal way?
Yes, right. Not Roman Catholic with
gotcha.
C, yeah.
Gotcha. Just to make sure, cool.
Sure.
I mean, not that I would have a problem with that, but just so the listeners know what we're talking about. Right. Yeah. Okay. Great. So just so you were looking for a job whilst the job market was disappearing, as COVID, was happening, and you landed the job in Harvard. That's pretty amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah, it does feel. Like I said, serendipitous is the word that comes to mind. Looking back, it feels as though there must have been some point to it.
Look, I'm sure merit played a pretty significant role there. So what I'm trying to do with the show is to really broaden out. I think I said it in my introduction episode that was like about 3 months ago, that one of the things I'm really interested in when it comes to happiness is this issue of scientism. So this idea that the scientific method kind of explains all, or can explain all. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think any scientists actually think that's the case, but we often behave that way, particularly when it comes to sort of explaining these things into the world. And so I think particularly when it comes to happiness, we're talking about virtues, we're talking about purpose, meaning in life. These are big questions that obviously have been discussed for a long time before the scientific method even existed. So I'm very, very pleased to be talking with you today would you call yourself a theologian?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really interested in I don't think that this would be a very well understood thing by the audience, I'm assuming. So it would be great if we could just briefly scope out kind of what is theology and how does it differ from psychological research?
Yeah, it's a large question.
Sorry.
It's actually an area, it's an ongoing area of research within our program. It's something that I'm essentially concerned with, is trying to work out, trying to develop more systematic, more articulate approaches to integrating the various disciplines that are represented in our program, including theology, and particularly across the humanities, social sciences boundary. And so, this is as with any large, venerable field of inquiry, if you ask 5 theologians to define theology, you get 8 answers back, right? So it's not as though I don't pretend to speak with any authority exactly about the state of the field or anything like that. But broadly speaking, this is just etymologically speaking, theology in the really basic sense is just talk about God talk, right? So, and that in one sense is quite a narrow focus. Theologians are just interested in understanding as much as we can about God, presuming that such a thing exists, right? Obviously, a contested idea today, but given the kinds of claims that theologians, Christians, but from lots of traditions, both East and West, or want to make about God, that very quickly expands our writ, so to speak, like the scope of our inquiry to include effectively everything. If you take it, for instance, that everything is either God or is brought into being out of nothing in every instant of its existence by God, and is sort of destined in some sense to return to God as its ultimate end, then properly speaking, everything falls within the scope of theological inquiry. And so in another sense, it's in a way the most capacious field possible. And theologians in the Middle Ages kind of peaked themselves as being practitioners of the queen of the sciences. That was sort of theology self-understanding. It's like as the kind of master discipline that integrated all of the other disciplines. Practitioners of other disciplines today are obviously less than keen on that self-designation, which is fine. I mean, I think that the demotion is in many respects well deserved. There's lots of ways of contrasting what theologians do with what psychologists do. There's also lots of interesting areas of overlap, I think, which is why dialogue is possible and fruitful. You might think at one level in terms of methods, right? So psychology, at least when it is being reflective, which as you indicated often, this is not always the case, but psychologists at least tend to try to be empirically minded, at least to a great degree, right? To describe the world as it is, and to bracket questions about sort of normative commitments of various kinds, so discussing here the world as it is, not as it ought to be necessarily. Theologians take a very keen interest in those kinds of normative commitments that are screened out by the sort of empirical focus of the sciences in general, right? So at one level there's a kind of complementarity. The psychologists can tell you the way the world actually is. Theologians have views, at least, about the way the world ought to be. Sorry,
just to jump in, just the normative. I hear a lot. Theology is an emerging interest for me. I hear the term normative very often. I think I know what it means, but I might just quickly get you to just define that.
Basically, it's I'm just gesturing towards the is-ought distinction, basically. That on the one hand, there are a set of claims about the way the world is. On the other hand, normative here meaning related to norms, rules, right? So most of us have carry on some version of this distinction intuitively, that the world in many ways is not the way we'd like it to be, both for ourselves existentially and then also, in larger sort of systemic senses, and so theology is not unique. There are lots of disciplines. I mean, the closest analog really in disciplinary terms to theology has always been philosophy, and distinguishing theology and philosophy in a way is one of the key tasks. Is always one of the key tasks for theologians in particular. Theology. I mean, one way of thinking about it, I guess, is that theology is sort of philosophy plus, in a way. I mean, it's theologians are interested in all the things that philosophers are interested in. Employ a lot of the same texts and conceptual tools, but sort of overlay the, philosophy in a way is it's a kind of it's a more ascetic discipline, right? So you're trying to work out what you can know about this or that domain, including God, for instance. Lots of philosophers are interested in God as well, just from what you can see in the world and from what you can be reasonably confident of knowing, just by being a rational creature, right? That sort of thing,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yep.
and theology, of course, adds to that a commitment. Again, lots of debate about what this means, but a commitment, in some sense, to taking very seriously this long, mostly textual tradition, right? Which sort of is centered on the Christian Bible, the Old and New Testaments, and it's now 2,000-year plus reception across an absolutely vast array of traditions in terms of time and space, and it's a body of literature and a set of debates really about how to understand God, how to understand the human person, how to understand the world, and our place in it, which is like with the history of philosophy. Philosophy is like theology in this way as well, but it doesn't make progress in the way that the sciences do, in the way that it's perfectly conceivable that a competent physicist today might never have read Isaac Newton, or even Einstein, right?
Yeah.
It's not really. It's not. I mean, there's some analytic philosophers who try to act as though this were true, but I think most philosophers, like most theologians, recognize that you can't be a competent philosopher without having some pretty deep engagement with Aristotle, and you can't be a competent theologian without having some deep engagement with Aristotle and also with the text of Scripture and with its long reception, right? So, and that's a corpus. It's a body of literature that's so immeasurably vast that no one person could hope to have anything like expertise in all of it. So it's a collective enterprise for that reason.
Yeah, great. And I guess just as a really concrete example of that, someone that I'm scheduling, we've had to reschedule a few times, is Professor Jennifer Frey. And I mean, she seems like she's got this incredible body of work. But why I was so interested to have her on, she wrote something about Thomas Aquinas and happiness, and why. When I kind of was approaching her, I said, positive psychology, it basically always mentions Aristotle and then stops. I don't think any of those people, like the large majority, haven't read Aristotle. I'm in this camp. I'm guilty. I've mentioned Aristotle's definitions of eudaimonia versus hedonia or whatever. I've never read it. I've mentioned it, and then have never referenced anything else that happened since. And this idea of I'm really interested in this conversation with Jennifer then around, what did Aquinas have as the person, in my, layman's characterization of the person who brought together Aristotle and Christian, theology. What did he gain by the theology on top of the Aristotle? But so in terms of methods, just briefly, I'm almost wondered, I'm guessing you as a team, you're a very multidisciplinary team. You're sitting in an office. This may or may not happen. I'm just imagining you sit in an office and you think, here's this research question, and then the theologian stands up and says we should answer it this way, and then the psychologist says no, we should do it this way. How does that play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends on the. I would say it varies a lot depending on the kind of question that's in play. So the disciplines work together at many stages of the various projects that we're engaged in, but they work together differently in different stages, I would say. So quite a lot of what we do is measure development, actually. So develop new psychometric, self-report survey measures of different psychological constructs, traits. We're particularly interested in virtues, which is quite a neglected topic, to be honest, within the literature. And so, we start, typically, our work begins as we approach the idea of developing a new measure, say, of some type of interpersonal love or of hope, say, as a virtue, by getting around a table and spending time, really a lot of time. I mean, this typically goes on for months. Working through the humanists really leading the conversation in sort of classic discussions of this concept from the history of philosophy and theology, and so we very often go back to Aristotle. Aquinas tends to play a starring role. We have a couple of philosophers in our program who are experts in the thought of Søren Kierkegaard, who's a great 19th century Danish philosopher, and so we take really seriously the idea that we still have, we here meaning humanity collectively, but academics in particular have a lot to learn from these figures. There's a tendency, I think, an unfortunate tendency in some pockets of the social sciences and some parts of analytic philosophy as well, to disparage anything not written by a practicing scientist as sort of folk psychology, and I do think that there's a place for the analytical category of folk psychology in reference to a lot of popular beliefs about the way our minds work, that sort of thing. But if that category has any purchase, it has absolutely nothing to do with what Aristotle wrote, or what Thomas Aquinas wrote, or Shakespeare. These people are still being read in the sort of careful devotional, way they are by so many smart people, because they speak to something really essential. The stuff that there's plenty of folk psychology was being done when Aristotle was alive, but about 90%, interestingly, of the tragically of the books written in the ancient world have not survived, have not come down to us. Mostly that's not through them being like heaped on a pyre and burned. It's just because people lost interest in them and didn't copy them. This was a period where you had to actually physically hand copy books for them to survive. So we can be reasonably confident that the 10% that's made it down to us, particularly the really, really elite, like the 0.1% of that 10%, that non-specialists would know about, that stuff is worth taking very seriously, So that's really where we start. So at the front end, our work in measure development, say, is often really led by humanists, sort of trying to lay out, okay, so conceptually, how might we understand different dimensions, say, of here are some intuitive hypotheses, at least, about different dimensions, say, of love. So our work on love in particular, which is as you mentioned, very salient for me, and also is occupying a lot of time in our program, has been driven really from the start by the hypothesis that there are sort of essentially two latent constructs bound up together within ordinary language use of love. So on the one hand, there's the two dimensions that we distinguish between are we call them unitive and contributory love. So it's essentially both of them consist in, as Aquinas says, the desire for the good of the other, willing the good of the other. That is love. But you can do that in two very quite distinct ways. So on the one hand, you can desire a kind of communion with the other, sort of being with the other, and there's lots of different ways of desiring that. There's a kind of unit of love that's appropriate to, say, an ice cream cone, right? A kind of unit of love that's appropriate to a friend or to a spouse or your children. And then also there's this other disposition, though, which is consistent with unit of love. It goes together with it, but it's not the same, which is the desire to contribute to the good of the other, the desire to ensure that the other flourishes according to its kind in appropriate ways, irrespective of how they sort of that feeds directly into your own subjective well-being, say, or advances your agenda, and that's a distinction that came right off the page from Aquinas for us, and has been very generative in thinking. I mean, we then do go on to do the more usual things, cognitive testing and factor analysis and that sort of stuff with items that we develop. But then, we do think that it's. On the other hand, there's the danger, the constant danger that humanists face is tricking themselves into thinking that just because they've read some books that they're like really psychologists or sociologists, and they end up doing kind of armchair sociology or armchair psychology. Yeah. And so, by the same token, I think that there's when we the humanists within the program, when we write about, particularly about questions that touch on ethics or sort of human nature, those sorts of things. We're not unique in this by any means among humanists today, but I do think that we make an unusual effort to be disciplined empirically in the claims that we make, so there's it's very much a two-way street, in terms of the kinds of exchange that we that we engage in the program's work. And then on the other side, the other thing I'll just mention is at the end, once we have data, say we fielded a measure, ideally we have, now say we've collected data on at least 3 time points is sort of what we try to do, right? So this takes a long time as well, and now we're writing, our outcome-wide study or whatever. Humanists are involved as well in the drafting and actually analyzing the results, drafting the paper that goes on to be published, so that we, we typically don't venture too far outside the introduction and discussion sections, say, of these papers, but trying to really enrich the interpretation of the results, trying to help the social scientists, in our group, widen their zoom a bit to think, with a little more historical texture, maybe introduce some distinctions that might not have occurred to them, So anyway, we view it very much as a case of complementary skill sets, complementary interests, which are mutually enriching, ideally.
I remember being even at school when you have to choose your, when you're starting to get into senior school and choosing your, what classes you're going to take, and at university the same thing. I just remember this feeling of, what's the best field, that these are competing things, chemistry is the highest thing, or physics, or I just so clearly remember that, and I wish someone had shook me at that time and said it's actually that's because I think you're tying your identity to it or something, like I'm going to be whatever, the smartest one, I'm going to be part of the best one. I wish someone had sort of almost shaken me at that time, say it's an ecosystem, and that these things all contribute usefully. I just feel like that messaging is completely missing in the early days of study, to be honest. But why I'm so excited to see the work that happens in your team is that, when we're talking about well-being, I just want to make this very concrete, I guess, for listeners, of why are we talking theology and sort of happiness. It's like, if we're thinking of well-being as the first step of being this idea of maybe the generative good, so what is good for someone, it doesn't take very many steps to then I guess understand, what is good for someone, who can give me that answer. I guess theology or philosophy is then saying, well, here is this body of work of theologians, of philosophers who have considered this question. Theologians obviously have a very similar idea, but then if we're looking at what can psychologists tell us, it's really about attaching it, I guess, to an outcome like we have, like life satisfaction, of what are the biggest contributors to life satisfaction. That comes with a presupposition that life satisfaction is the good that we should be chasing. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's almost that presupposition is the thing that I could see has been almost not miscommunicated or misunderstood, but I'm not trying to be unfair, but almost overlooked in a way by most of, not the field, I don't think, but the way that the field has been interpreted. It's the presupposition, and I wonder whether that's something that is a part of the dialogue within your team.
Yeah, very much. I just earlier today was thinking a lot about life satisfaction as part of the paper that we're working on collaboratively. And it's just to take that as an illustration. There are good reasons that so much energy has been invested in trying to measure life satisfaction. In a way, I think there's some path dependence involved here, in a way that, the more people measure it, the more incentive there is to measure it.
Yeah.
And so the OECD's gotten on board, right? And, the UK is pushing it in a big way. So there's some of that. But I do think it is, if you're going to use, for my money, it probably is the best single item measure. Flourishing. Mm-hmm. If you can only ask someone one question, the advantage, of course, of life satisfaction, and this is a point that Ed Diener, made about it from the beginning, is that it really leaves wide open the question of what the respondent will factor in. So they can anything that matters to you. You can bundle in and you can weight them in various ways. That's the theory, at least, right? The theory is, and this is a bit naive in the way it's presented. As someone who's responding is going to sit back and spend a long time writing down all the things that matter in their life and assigning weights to them, and the reason, if that really were how the exercise went, in terms of how people respond to life satisfaction, it would be a fantastic, probably a perfect measure of flourishing. Of course, no one does that actually, right? And so it ends up being a pretty rough proxy, very rough proxy for overall flourishing, because it is just empirically, there's lots of evidence that it's people's responses are not determined, but are weighted in various ways by like how hot the room is, and like the last conversation they had, and I mean, lots of totally irrelevant stuff. Extroverts are just more likely to be satisfied with their lives, right? We know all of these things. So yeah, so our view, the kind of theory about flourishing that really drives our program, our program's work is a very self-consciously Aristotelian alternative to the fixation on life satisfaction, or the really any single construct approach to assessing flourishing, however however you want to frame that. So we have our program director Tyler Vanderwill, who's an epidemiologist and biostatistician. He developed in 2017 a 12-item sort of short measure of flourishing, which is divided into 5 domains with a kind of half optional 6th domain that consists of material well-being, which I'll come back, I guess, in a second to why it doesn't really count as a full one. But the first of them is subjective well-being, so happiness and life satisfaction, which matters a lot. I mean, there's no question. Pretty much everybody you go around the world, wants positively balanced experiences. They want a life that seems choice-worthy of them in some way, But we think you also have to assess, if you want a really full-orbed understanding of a life that goes well, you also need to think about things like character and virtue. You need to think about the extent to which someone's life is meaningful, filled with purpose. You need to think about their relationships. You need to think about their health, physical and mental health, which is amazingly left off of tons and tons of research in positive psychology. It's just totally bracketed. Yeah. So anyway, in our view, and this is, again, as I said, very self-consciously an Aristotelian view, and in a different way. I mean, honestly, I think it's even more, in a way, a sort of New Testament view. In my view, is that a life that is genuinely flourishing is one in which all aspects of your life are going well. So the idea that you could just home in on some narrow slice of the human experience and take that as a kind of stand-in for flourishing as a whole is, in my view, I guess it's just naive. It's not. There are certain contexts in which that kind of reductive exercise is the least bad option, or in which it's destructive in various ways. But from a standpoint of theory, the interesting thing is, this is an argument that has been hashed out a bunch of times in the history of philosophy, So in a way, it goes back to I would say Aristotle's debates with, on the one hand, the so-called hedonists, the Epicureans, and then on the other hand, the Stoics, who said that the only thing that matters is character. That it doesn't matter if you're being tortured and if your children are killed in front of you or whatever. As long as you're a virtuous person, then you're perfectly happy. And there are good reasons, most of them intuitive, to reject both of those positions. Something like the Aristotelian position is probably the best one on philosophical grounds. But this is something which psychologists, unfortunately, who are sort of innocent of that history, are doomed to repeat it, basically. End up sort of adopting one or another, sort of limited perspective that's been successfully criticized actually a bunch of times in the last 2,000 years.
And that's actually the heart of the matter, I guess, isn't it? Is that idea of you said it perfectly. That idea that naive of the work that's been done in the past, and you're basically doomed to, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Right. That is the feeling that I get when I hear friends who are not theologians but theologically inclined, of just like, it's really not new what's coming out of psychology. Maybe that's an overstated idea, but it is definitely the sentiment that I often get. It's like, actually, this has been had, this conversation. And I mean, I think to a certain extent that's becoming truer, I think, happily, in the last decade, maybe, because there was a period, relatively short period, maybe in the history of the discipline, where, especially social psychology was just consumed by
kind of faddish, like counterintuitive findings, you know, and so
Okay.
everything had to be, you know, it was like all of these experiments about priming, you know, and you know, I can't remember the author, but there's a famous one which supposedly showed that, you know, college students who spent time looking at a casting of Rodin's Thinker were more likely to self-describe as atheists
Okay.
after that, you know, those kinds of, I mean, lots of, you know, that people who were primed with words associated with the elderly would walk slower, you know, after lots, not all of them are, you know, about like mind control, you know, but
Yeah.
anyway, and these it turns out, you know, that when the replication crisis sort of broke in the open in 2015 or so, an awful lot of these findings failed to replicate. You know, when the I can't remember the name of the Center for Open Science, right, started trying to replicate a lot of these studies in starting in 2015, and you know, 30% maybe.
Lo and behold, yeah.
Those would, you know, and I do think this is a case where again, if the researchers conducting the experiment had been ballasted a bit more by a richer conception of human nature, you know, that was not, because I mean, you know, the sort of model, the implicit model of what a human being is like, that's at play in these in the most extreme of these priming studies is it's almost totally behaviorist, you know. I mean, in the sense that like we're basically just at the mercy of all of these really subtle external forces. We have no idea what's actually determining, you know, our beliefs or judgments moment to moment, and you know, it's not that you can't find anybody necessarily in the history of philosophy or theology who's taken a view like that, but almost no one has, for good reasons. I think that this is just a pretty implausible model of, and frankly, in most other social scientific disciplines as well, that's just not the dominant model. In political science, say, you know, not the dominant model of human nature, and so yeah, I do think that it's a, you know, you don't have to get this. You can get this from lots of places, you know, and to some extent, I think thoughtful psychologists have thought their way to these more robust conceptions of human nature without having to, you know, you don't have to get a PhD in philosophy to do this, but you do need to. I think everyone needs to recognize that you are in fact presupposing some kind of theory of human nature.
Exactly.
In the empirical work you do, and to the extent that that's a thin or inadequate model, the results that you produce are going to be implausible, you know, or you're going to be. The thing is, I think in many cases, there's a good case. There's a very interesting book about this whole problem, published a couple of years ago by the journalist Jesse Singal. It's called what's it called? Sorry, I should have it on my desk, I suppose. The name will come to me. It'll come to me as soon as I log off.
Yeah.
I'll look it up in a second.
No stress.
The point is, so Singal, he makes the point that you know, it's not that. I mean, these studies, they were well designed, many of them, in the sense that they genuinely did pass the relevant p-value cutoff or whatever. You know, they had p-values of 0.04 or whatever. So like, they're well designed. It's not as though people weren't necessarily faking the results. You know, it's just that in this case, when the result is as implausible as like looking at the Rodin's Thinker turning people into atheists, like shouldn't the p-value cutoff have been set way lower?
Yeah. I'm with you.
Are we really willing to accept like a 1 in 20 chance that?
Yeah, and it's funny. And it's and that's almost like I'm speaking like way out of my league here, but even like it's a low bar of like epistemic truth or something like that. Like if you walk around thinking that all I need to do is reach this p-value and then it's truth, and for people, I guess I think most of the audience will know what we mean by p-value, but this idea of I run my statistical test, every test has an arbitrary cutoff or a semi-arbitrary cutoff point where you say if it meets this point, I'll accept it as true. That's a weak epistemological, you know, conceptualization of what truth is, I guess, and that's where maybe people who have studied literally epistemology or this idea of truth, how do we know what we know, are protected from that issue.
Yeah, and this is definitely a case where, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting, very direct interaction between kind of recent I guess it's philosophy. I don't know if it's logic or probability exactly, but there's this whole development in 19th century a philosophy of logic and probability called Bayes' theorem, associated with this. I can't remember, it's George Bayes, I guess is his name. But anyway, there has been this move, I gather, in some corners of the social sciences towards what's called like a Bayesian approach to setting the p-value. So basically, you start before you don't assume that the arbitrary 0.05 cutoff is somehow immovably set for all time. When you formulate your hypothesis, you ask yourself, how unlikely is this result, like in the real world? And you use that intuition to set. Again, this is somewhat arbitrary, but you say, well, like, am I willing to accept 1 in 100 odds, or like, am I actually willing to accept 1 in 20 odds that this result is spurious, or am I going to have to say, only if it clears the 1 in 1,000 threshold?
Exactly.
For statistical significance, am I going to be willing to go to the mat and say, no, this is actually a valid result, as opposed to just a fluke, so. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think I'm just, as you've been talking, by the way, I think is the book called The Quick Fix?
Yeah, Quick Fix.
Yeah, okay, great.
Exactly.
Dr. Google.
Highly recommend it, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'll check it out. I remember, I think it was, what's his name? Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman. I remember hearing him maybe on like a podcast or something, or maybe it was in one of his books, this idea that he was almost saying, I won a Nobel Prize for suggesting that humans are irrational, basically. And this idea of like economics was set, all these economic theories were set on the assumption that humans make rational decisions. And then Kahneman comes in and basically says, actually, they often are irrational. It's like in the language I think that we're speaking, I can see that as an example of having a broader understanding of human nature actually quickly identified a huge glaring issue in a field that was completely oblivious to it without that sort of understanding of human nature. Does that kind of resonate with what you?
Yeah, very much. And this is, this is another area. The rise of the biases and heuristics literature, which Kahneman and Tversky were the kind of central figures in. To my mind, it has lots of interesting anticipations in the history of philosophy and theology in terms of, the kind of pick examples at random. Some of my favorites are from from Blaise Pascal. He's a 17th century.
Yep.
Really became famous as a mathematician and inventor, brilliant physicist and mathematician. But he turned in the second half of his short life, sadly short life, to writing philosophy and theology, and he's very famous.
I didn't know that.
He's very famous for a book that was left incomplete at his death called the Pensées, the Thoughts, and it was meant to be a kind of, I think the title he had given it for himself is an apology for Christianity. Basically, it's meant to be a kind of work of apologetics, basically.
Is that where like Pascal's wager, is it from that work that it comes from? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, right. So, but he has a lot to say in that book about the absurdity of our pretensions to impartiality.
You're going to have to explain that one.
Well, like so I'll just give you some examples. He has funny things to say about the way we sort of pride ourselves on the impartiality of our justice system. He's saying we, the French, that we invest so much time and energy in this system of courts and trials, and they wouldn't have called it due process at that point, but due process essentially. But he says, the reality is that if the defendant happens to be horribly disfigured, or if the defendant is on the other hand, tall and handsome, or if the judge has a backache that day or whatever, we know that those things can completely change the outcome of the case. And there are I don't think this is one of Kahneman's studies, but there are real world studies. A very interesting paper I read in a review years ago about rates of it was looking at the the rates at which an Israeli, a tribunal of, or whatever, panel of Israeli judges commuted or granted parole. It was an Israeli parole board. The rates at which they granted parole, and it turned out, someone looked at this one board over time. They were much more likely to grant parole right after lunch. The lowest rates of granting parole right before lunch, highest rates right after lunch. So sucks to be the person whose case comes up right before lunch.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is Pascal. He's very famous. One of the most famous lines from the Pensées is the heart has its reasons, which reason knows not. And it's something very much like, you can, I think, align it pretty cleanly with what Kahneman meant by, sort of system 1 and system 2. That there's an aspect of our being, I guess you might say, or of our cognitive and affective life, which is largely unconscious, it's just sort of intuitive. It operates from the heart, so to speak. But it does form judgments, and it has a way of orienting us to the world in terms of decision making and goals and that sort of thing. And it just turns out most of the time reason just has no access to that, which is pretty much exactly what Kahneman meant. I think I don't know that Kahneman had ever read Pascal, but I think he would have liked him if he had, So it's a nice example. You might say, well, Pascal had intuitions, but Kahneman had data or whatever, and that's fair enough to a certain extent, I think. But what it does illustrate is that Pascal, he this is not unusual, really, in the history of philosophy of theology. He was interested in cases as well. He wasn't assembling really rigorously quantitative empirical cases for the theses that he was advancing in the way that we're now able to do with big data sets and RCTs and statistics and that sort of thing. But he is still interested in the fit between theory and
Gotcha.
evidence, right? So he tries to marshal evidence to say here's a common situation. You'll recognize this, you the reader. As soon as you see this, you'll recognize, that's something that I experience. And I think that kind of argument, to my mind, remains very powerful. I guess I would say I'm a big fan of presumptive arguments up to a point. That if it's the sort of thing that everybody's grandmother would have known was true 70 years ago, the burden of proof is on you if you don't think that's true, basically.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Not that that's in plenty of cases. That burden can be met.
Yeah. Gotcha.
These things, common sense becomes common sense for a reason in general. And the idea that we have a kind of epistemic obligation to suspend judgment about about gravity.
Sure.
Until someone's worked out the equations for us I find that psychologically it's not very plausible. No one lives like that. No psychologist lives like that. Anyway, for good reasons.
No, I'm with you. And so I'm hoping that I see this conversation as having stayed very closely to the theme of well-being and flourishing. I'm not sure whether the audience will have seen that, but and sorry, just one point of clarification. I just wanted to clarify for people that are listening, Pascal's wager, I guess, just to basically characterize that, the idea that it's a safer bet to believe and act as if God existed rather than to not, right? Is that just a very...
Yeah, very basically, that's the... Other things being equal. It does get much more complicated than that, interestingly. It might be worth it. This is, just at the level of psychology, too, this is a very interesting case of Pascal as a very subtle psychologist.
Let's go.
After he introduces this idea, that if you have to choose between living as though God exists and living as though he doesn't, and he's imagining here, basically you're risking
heaven or hell, basically.
Eternity in hell, eternity in heaven, right? So safe bet for sure. Better bet is live as though God exists. That's the idea. But the interesting thing is, immediately after he lays out that argument, his sort of interlocutor in the Pensées retorts and says, "Well, okay, that's very interesting, Pascal. Maybe that's true, but here's the problem: I don't believe in God. It's like telling someone, to believe that there's a gorilla standing next to you or something like that. It's a nice idea, but psychologically, how do I do that?" And Pascal says, "Well, that's, fair enough, no problem. Here's what you do: go to church every day, he says, take holy water, he's thinking as a, very pious Catholic, so like pray the rosary, do all the stuff that you would do if you believe that God exists. And what you'll find, he says, is that, and this is a great example of the heart's reasons, which reason knows not. You'll find that actually what you're doing as you inhabit this way of life, which is the sort of Christian way of being in the world, is that what used to seem like insuperable, like logical objections to believing that God exists or to believing, that Jesus is the Savior or whatever, will over time seem less they'll be less concerning to you, and eventually you'll find yourself able eventually actually to believe. So the idea is the idea basically is that we can it's a kind of hack, that you can operate indirectly, that people often think, and not to say that some people really just do have insuperable, very sincere insuperable intellectual objections to this or that religious proposition or whatever, but very often I think Pascal, what he's rightly picking up on is, what we think are real reasons for not wanting to do X, Y, or Z are in fact more like rationalizations, and there's some there's some deeper underlying reluctance, and you can operate on the real reasons, so to speak, by habituation, basically by just acting as though this were true, So anyway, it's to my mind fits. Is borne out very well by an awful lot of empirical work that's been done by the biases and heuristics sort of crowd, and anyway, he's an interesting guy, Pascal. Just one illustration of someone to think with. If you want a theological interlocutor as a psychologist, very
awesome. One question I'm going to ask at the end is how does someone start when they want to get into theology? But we won't go there just yet. What I would love. So, I mean, the way that I've seen this conversation going so far, just to sort of give some sort of map to the discussion so far, has been this idea of when we're talking about well-being, psychology is not the only field that has some weighing in on this topic. There are huge bodies of work from other disciplines and other ways of knowing that are available to us. And that a team like yours, which has those combinations within it, I think is just well established to be actually pushing this forward faster than others. And I think you've given some really, really good examples of how that might be the case. So hopefully I'm guessing for people that are listening, they're completely seeing how this has been close to well-being and to flourishing. What I would really love to just hear from you now is this idea of your theological account of love. So something we can talk about offline is that some measurement development that we've been doing, and part of that has been a big systematic review of the available measures of well-being, and we took an intentionally broad view of what well-being was to include quality of life and resilience and coping. Because these literatures kind of partially overlap and no one can really clearly delineate them in some ways. And as a result, we did pick up on, health and personal circumstances and these sorts of things, which most of pos psych doesn't, as you mentioned. What I thought was incredible was that love almost didn't show up, basically at all. I think I looked up. So what we did was we found about 150 measures of well-being, of mental health, I guess, or positive mental health, whatever. We looked at, what did they say they were measuring in terms of what were the sub-dimensions of their measures. And I just did it so then from 155 measures, we found 400 and something sub-dimensions. Again, terrible use of language, partially overlapping, blah, blah, blah. We can talk about that later. I did a control F of love before this conversation, basically. And I think of those 400, love showed up 4 times. Yeah. Once was love of God. And I think there was love of self a few times. And so really, I think it was 1 out of 400 measures of these subdimensions really talked about this idea of love. There's obviously a lot of personal relationships and sort of closeness with others, but love does not show up. So I was extremely interested to hear about the work you've been doing on love.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not particularly surprised, by that finding. I mean, I do think there, as you mentioned, there's relatively more attention given to various kinds of close personal relationships. You know,
Yep.
those which are kind of proxies, you might say, for love. They're contexts in which you hope that love is present. Obviously, not all, your mileage may vary there with lots of, you know, not all marriages are loving marriages, of course,
Sure.
as we know, right? That sort of thing. But yeah. Uh, well, okay. So just, I mean, I guess as a very broad overview of that work. I mean, this is work that I'm individually pretty deeply invested in at the moment in terms of my own research and writing, but it's a major priority of the program as a whole at the moment. So we have a 3-year project that's funded by the John Templeton Foundation
Yep.
to whose primary deliverables will be a new set of psychometric measures, self-report measures of 7 different types of interpersonal love.
Great.
Running and sort of covering most of the most significant relationships in a person's life. So spousal love, parent-child love, friendship. Trying to think of the other sort of intimate ones. So those are the only ones. But then sort of moving out as well. I mean, this is one of the things we're interested in doing. Is we've just worked up a set of items on love of neighbor. We've been working on love of enemy as well, actually, which is of particular interest to me, and the love of God as well, actually.
Yeah.
So and yeah, I mean the I mean, this is maybe somewhat, maybe a somewhat grandiose way of putting it, but I would say the hypothesis is sort of animating a lot of our work on love and human flourishing, which is how we're sort of conceiving of the project as a whole. Is that in some sense, loving relationships, including loving relationships potentially, say, with God, are if the essence might be putting it too strongly, but they're at the heart, they're the core in some sense of a flourishing life. Both in the sense that loving relationships are critical pathways to flourishing in many domains, so for most people they're the deepest source of meaning, say, in a person's life, profound occasions for developing character, a virtuous character in many. I can, speaking I think particularly very intimate relationships, life together with a spouse, life as a parent, it's enormously sort of challenging, in terms of moral formation day to day, at least for very, very bad people like me, I guess. But then also, that love in a way is among the intrinsic goods, that flourishing consists in. Love is it's the most important of them, in the sense that it's, if you're given the option. I mean, this is somewhat complicated when you think about things like, I mean, in a way, is it's complicated because love is a dyadic relationship. It's, I mean, with bracketing self-love, which is a sort of an interesting exceptional case, I guess. It orients you to someone else, so it's a way for me to be in the world, right? So this is an excellent way for me to be. This is a good way for my own life to be configured, to have this disposition of loving another. But it presupposes this sort of investment, in this other person out there, right? So anyway, but I think that the one of our affiliates, actually, faculty affiliates in our program, is Arthur Brooks, who's at the Kennedy School here, and is a very influential, popular. He's a labor economist, actually, but has become a kind of he's moved into this space as well, wellbeing research. And great. I mean, I just saw the other day, actually, that he's publishing a book with Oprah, apparently. So, so his life's about to change, But anyway, he says a lot. Something I've heard him say a number of times, which rings true for me. I think it's borne out by quite a lot of evidence as well. Is that like one kind of core rule for all of human life is don't trade anything for love. That this is and this is something we're constantly tempted to do, I think, in many aspects of daily life, particularly in professional life, say, to trade away time with loved ones, say, investment, in our children and our families, anyway, and this is it's a lot of evidence that long term this is just a really bad bargain. That it's a recipe for being having a lot of regrets and being very lonely and isolated, in the later part of your life. And anyway, so, and you often hear people say, I mean, don't have them myself, but people always say, I've heard many grandparents say, you never regret having more grandkids, like you can't have too many grandkids, this is people don't tend to say that about like number of hours worked,
Yeah.
So anyway, right, I mean, I think that this is a case where what we're doing is chasing a set of intuitions, really, which I think are very well grounded, both in the history of let's just say, the Western intellectual tradition in a broad sense, but in many traditions too. Buddhism has its own versions of this, right?
Yeah.
The kind of universal vocation to compassion, that sort of thing. But yeah, and so the hope is to really put that. Well, I mean, the hope is to use the measures eventually to initiate something like an epidemiology of love. So to embed them in various longitudinal studies, develop panel data where we can actually see, what's predicting the development of love as a trait, and what are the outcomes. If someone becomes more loving, what does that do in a person's life for all kinds of outcomes, from physical health up through psychosocial well-being, spiritual well-being. Yeah, I mean, it is massively understudied for how important it is. It is, I agree, massively understudied. I mean, even just we've done quite a lot of literature review and for this measured development project of measures of love. There's tons of them, tons of self-styled measures of love. About 80% of them, I think, are romantic love, basically, as you might expect. And the other, 20%. I mean, that's a rough measure. I don't remember off the top of my head what the actual figure was, but it was an overwhelming majority. We're focused on romantic love. And the others, tend to be kind of thin. I think that would be the
kind of like a symptom of a generations of people watching rom-coms, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it. I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, clearly, it's a very important relationship. It's not as though that's you don't want to downplay the significance of it necessarily, but yeah, I mean, our view, and this in a way is quite directly inspired really by thinking with the New Testament, say with the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, is that the human vocation to love, in a sense, is universal. I mean, the vocation really is, as an aspiration, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, I mean, there's a famous exchange in the Gospel of Luke where a teacher of the law asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells this story about a man who was robbed, on the way from Jericho to Jerusalem, and left, stripped, beaten, and left for dead by the side of the road. And a priest comes by and ignores him, and a Levite comes by and ignores him, and then the loathsome Samaritan comes by and stops and helps him and washes his wounds and takes care of him. And Jesus says, which one of these was the neighbor? And obviously it's the Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is where we get this expression from. So that's the paradigm of neighbor love is really love for. I mean, the interesting thing is in that relationship, that's really the Samaritan helping this Jewish man. Samaritans and Jews didn't get along in this period.
Yeah, that's the context that's never understood about that story, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. Which is often left out, right? The Samaritans. I mean, this is clear even in other parts of the New Testament. Jesus has a conversation at one point in the Gospel of John with a Samaritan woman, and his disciples are scandalized because Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans, editorially. The narrator of the Gospel says. So yeah, a lot of bad blood. It's kind of complicated story about how this comes about, but yeah. So I mean, this is a case in a way. It's a case of neighbor love, but it's also in a way an instance both of stranger and of enemy love.
Yes.
This is someone he would have recognized. Samaritan would have recognized this person as someone who's on the wrong team, so to speak. And so that and I mean, to my mind, that's an extraordinarily difficult trait psychologically. To get inside, like, what is it like to actively seek the good of someone you are sure, at least pretty sure, hates you or doesn't, or would if they knew you, so to speak, right? I mean, if you, and this is, I mean, it's become, particularly in an American context where, the level of ill will among various segments of the population in terms of partisan politics or
Yeah.
increasingly racial divides, it's almost impossible to exaggerate.
I was just thinking, like, yeah, does the does the MAGA person help the hurt Antifa person,
right, exactly.
on the street? Like, that's almost never happening. You would imagine, like, by listening to the media. I'm sure it's not
It is,
necessarily.
yeah, and I mean, I do think that there is unfortunately, the very strong sort of negativity bias, in the media doesn't help, in the sense that, no one is boosting the ratings by running heartwarming stories about people, coming together across partisan divides. Or
Enemy love, yeah, exactly.
yeah, but I do think there, I mean, there honestly is some debate, I think, empirically about the extent to which negative polarization is increasing in America, and the extent to which partisan animosity is increasing, that sort of thing. But I mean, to my mind, the evidence is pretty clear that it has increased. At least it has increased significantly. I mean, maybe the extent of the increase has been oversold in some settings, but in recent decades, and there's some, to some extent that is a function in a way of the loss of a common vision, moral grammar, you might say, that used to more or less unite left and right, and the left and right genuinely have moved a lot farther apart. I think both each in their own direction, in the last 30 years or so, and that does actually make it much harder than it used to be to find common ground. We're not the racking neuralgic issues today aren't like, it's not marginal tax rates, and like what we're going to do about Social Security or whatever, in the way that it was 30 years ago. I mean, existentially much more pressing sort of questions have become a lot more salient, and so it's understandable that people are angrier than they used to be, but it's also just not a good situation for anybody.
No. So when I'm just wondering, maybe this is skipping ahead, this is an unfair question in a way, but I'll ask it anyway. When it comes to this idea of let's say love of enemy, right? So that's something obviously we're saying that we're thinking is disappearing, and there's no institution that's really fighting for it, right? In a way, in a modern sense, like no secular institution, let's say, that's arguing for this thing, or none that I'm aware of. I'm wondering, like, do you envision that you almost have Pascal's problem? That's kind of fitting, that you're gonna, let's just say you show up and you've got your measures and they're showing how important, like in this scientism kind of argument, like we have our own arguments for why we think love of neighbor is important, but now you have some empirical data to say, actually, here's why it's so relevant. What is then the impetus for people to start adopting it, do you think? Without the in a secular sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair question, I guess. I mean, it's this is a different sort of problem in a way in the States than it is in a lot of the developed world. I mean, in continental Europe, say, in the sense that America still today remains a much more religious place, like overtly religious place, than most of Europe, for instance. I think this is true of Australia as well, although I know less about religious participation there. And religious participation in a way is not even the best measure, I guess. I mean, the thing that I find really striking is I think it's still today about 50% of the American population professes belief, not just in God, but identifies with some specific religious tradition, but doesn't participate regularly. Like, doesn't go to church, doesn't go to synagogue, And so, I mean, to my mind, the pitch, and this is you can make this in lots of different ways, but one part of the pitch for this sort of vision I don't think it necessarily has to be a fully Christian vision, necessarily of enemy love. I mean, in a way, this is a teaching which you can. I'm very happy for anybody to make of it what they will. I mean, I think, and this is something I do wish, just as a sidebar. I mean, I wish that there were, just in the way that psychologists increasingly, in the last 30 years or so, have been sort of jumping feet first into classic Buddhist texts, and just like reading the Dhammapada, and let's just see what we can make of it, and without any presumption that you have to like ipso facto, if you're going to take any of it, you have to believe in reincarnation, or like accept that the Dalai Lama has been reincarnated 14 times, or I wish that more social scientists were doing that same kind of thing with the New Testament. Say, like, just pick it up, just see, read the Sermon on the Mount and see what stands out to you as something that you might take seriously as a way of life, and then the kind of merging of horizons question, like how you actually translate, what Jesus says about loving your enemy, which is very much these are very much theological claims, that for the New Testament, the paradigm of enemy love is St. Paul makes this very clear actually in his letter to the Romans that we're to love our enemies because when we were God's enemies, Jesus loved us. When we were, that's the paradigm that Jesus died for his enemies. Jesus died for people. He went to the cross, asking God to forgive the people who were killing him. Right? So that's but just because Christians have a particularly sort of rich way of motivating those views doesn't mean that others aren't possible, right? And you could maybe say, like, here's a vision of how you could live. For me, it's, obviously, I'm totally fine with it if someone tries on that form of life. The like, let me try to like genuinely love everyone around me. As those say, that doesn't have to be because God loves them, but love them as if they were creatures made in God's image, whom God loved into being just the way He loves me, And if it turns out that as a result of sort of inhabiting that way of life, someone finds Christianity more plausible than they did before, like, that's great from my standpoint. But if not, like, it's still a good way of living as far as I'm concerned. It's I think there are this is not good necessarily in the sense that it will make you like wealthier or longer lived or something like that. But it's intrinsically this is a really good thing to do, to try to live this way. So yeah, my pitch would be like, try to approach this in a metaphysically low-flying way. Like, don't get stressed out about whether you have to believe that God exists if you want to take the idea of enemy love or neighbor love seriously. Just take it seriously as a potential way of life, as like a live option, as something you might try for yourself. And just the way people take Buddhist ideas about compassion, or one-pointed mindfulness or whatever seriously, without like strong commitments to, because there's a whole sort of Baroque Buddhist metaphysics too that's built up, in various traditions around all of this stuff as well, right? That it is kind of interesting. It's interesting to work out. I don't have a good theory about why it's gone this way, but there's a bit of a double standard, I think, in the way that people in the sciences relate to Eastern spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
To some extent, I get it. Buddhists are at least some traditions within Buddhism are less committed to, they tend not to be theists in the way that Christians are theists, so it's a little easier to secularize in that sense. Like maybe you don't believe in all of the demons and stuff flying around, but or maybe you don't believe in reincarnation, but they already believe maybe in less stuff than Christians do, so it's easier in that sense. But in both cases, there is a lot of translation that has to be done, even from Buddhism, in terms of turning these Buddhist commitments into something that your average psychologist today is willing to take seriously. So
I think it's really interesting. No, I'm with you on that. I think it's really interesting that the idea that I think at least for positive psychology, let's say, or even taking a step back, the mindfulness space has a very clear it clearly references the Buddhist tradition, right? And so it's very well understood that this is basically then the empirical investigation of this tradition. But I think something you just reminded me of something that one of your articles that I was reading, this idea that the West at least is so Christian virtue and values is so pervasive in Western culture that we almost don't even recognize the novelty of it, so I wonder whether that's a part of it too. It's like, in a way, if you're looking then to the East, it's like, oh, there's a source of this new wisdom, not recognizing the wisdom that is around us from a different tradition. It's kind of like the fish in water sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. And I do think that there's yeah, it's really easy for especially secular folks today. I mean, it's easy for Christians to do this as well, but to overlook the extent to which, I mean, something like a commitment to human rights is like basically that's a piece of secularized Christian theology. I mean, like it doesn't really emerge anywhere else. It emerges when it emerges for explicitly Christian reasons. And then eventually people start trying to detach it in various ways from that underlying those underlying commitments. And there's been good recent work done on this, and a lot of from by historians or so, secular historians of social sciences.
Thinking of Dominion.
Yeah, Tom Holland's a famous example of this. I was actually thinking. I mean, most immediately, I like Holland's work. He's very interesting. But I do think. I mean, if I were trying to make the appeal to social scientists, I think Joseph Henrich's work is even better in a way because it's so well grounded empirically.
Joseph Henrich.
Yeah, Henrich is he's the guy who coined the acronym weird people.
Oh, okay.
That's his thing. So he wrote a book, published a book, and he's actually here at Harvard. He's in the Human Evolutionary Biology department here at Harvard. And he published a book in 2020 called The Weirdest People in the World. And the thesis of the book basically is it's a kind of origin story about where weirdness comes from as a cultural form. And the thesis basically is that the church brought it into being, especially church norms around marriage and family had this sort of profound transformative effect over the course of centuries in restructuring society and then changing our psychology. And it's worked out in this really clever, very disciplined empirical way. I mean, it's like every 100 years, extra 100 years of exposure to the church's marriage and family plan, as he calls it, is like associated with, I can't remember what the percentage is, but some percentage rise in blood donations.
Really?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it's really, really well done. Yeah, so I think that
I'll look that up.
That's a case, and he's totally open in the book about. He says at one point that like the idea of immaterial souls makes about as much sense, he says, as the idea of someone who only exists on Tuesday and Thursday. Which is not to say not very much sense at all in his view. So he's not a religious guy, in any meaningful sense. But take seriously, the extent to which, the West, so to speak. I mean, this for him means, Western legal norms, weird. He has a whole chapter on weird science, which is
okay.
This is basically a product of this distinctively Christian culture. Make of that what you will. Maybe it can be detached. You pick the fruit, from the tree and you walk away and don't worry about where it came from. But yeah, I do think it's always worth directing people's attention to the fact that a lot of what they believe is basically Christianity without the God talk and stuff.
No, I'm with you. I absolutely, and I think the more you learn, it's so like if your like understanding of theology is like basically like from The Simpsons or something, or just stuff you've sort of inherited from sort of pop culture and whatever, you don't see it. But the more you look into it, you go, oh, okay, now I'm understanding the source.
Yeah,
and weird, just to clarify, sorry to interrupt, but just quickly, weird is the acronym, just so it's clear that we're not talking about like weirdo sort of thing. Weird being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic people. So sorry, just to. Yes, but please go on. What were we going to say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really instructive, I think, and this is what Holland is quite good for. Is to realize like in ancient Rome, it was like totally normal for people just to be able, like, if a father didn't want to keep his daughter, he could just kill her, and that was like totally within bounds culturally and legally, and that I mean, you could go on down the list. I mean, in terms of the way that I mean, so put it this way, there's a very famous thesis, I mean, it's, associated with Friedrich Nietzsche especially, although there are others before him who made it as well, that Nietzsche said that Christianity was a slave revolt in morality within the ancient world, and that in the sense that it was a kind of assertion on the part of people who were weak and dispossessed and at the dregs of society, in the ancient world. That it was a kind of revolt on their part, an effort to turn the table, so to speak, morally, so that things that had been devalued, humility, for instance, which is not a virtue for Aristotle, impartial kindness, again, not a virtue for Aristotle, suddenly are the pinnacle of virtue, and Nietzsche, who's an atheist and a kind of sneering would-be aristocrat, and inadvertently, I mean, you can't blame this on him exactly, but inadvertently a kind of, theorist for the Nazis too, right? So anyway, but Nietzsche, he tells this story as a tragedy, that all of the virile, sort of aristocratic virtues of the ancient world had been submerged by this pathetic slave revolt, and we had to get back, so to speak, to that. But so I would say, I mean, I think this is one of the virtues of Holland's book, as it documents pretty clearly that. So Nietzsche's right about this. I mean, it's absolutely true. He's totally wrong about the significance of it,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in my view, it's a great thing, actually,
Yeah.
that the slave revolt happened. I mean, for one thing, it is worth pointing out that it took us too long to do it, but like every abolitionist movement in the history of the world, pretty much has been Christian in inspiration, at least indirectly. And the first abolitionists were like very sincere, passionate Christians. Quakers, were the ones who got on board first, and so it's literally a slave revolt in the end. But so I think that's it's very easy to overlook. We're so used to this way of being. The idea that everyone has equal dignity, and a poor person's life is worth just as much as a rich. In principle, obviously, in practice, we have a long way to go. But in terms of moral norms, all of those are so intuitive to us that it's really hard to think back to a world in which like no one thought that, and it was just taken for granted that the powerful would dominate the weak, and that was what society existed for, was to advance the excellence of the best and the brightest lineages, and that's so anyway, yeah, I mean, I think that's Christianity is not the only factor, but it's certainly, I would say, the dominant factor in explaining why we don't think that way anymore.
Are there any, just while we're on this topic, I know it's probably a side note, but, actually, no, it's not, but is there any, like, what would be the most reputable disagreement to that idea?
Oh, yeah.
Like, if there's a book that you could reference, or an author, or... Right,
yeah, sure. I mean, well, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, who's the most serious version of the case, sort of, I mean, and you're talking here about the case against Christianity's sort of historic cultural influence.
That's right. Yeah. For the, I guess, for the betterment of,
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are lots of other ways of telling that story about the emergence, say, of the modern culture of rights talk, say, democratic institutions. The things that I'm referencing here as in a way, sort of products. Bastard children, at least, say, of the church, if not like true-born heirs. So there are, I mean, just the first person who comes to mind, I mean, he's not necessarily the best even, but I mean, a very popular version of a very different story is the historian Jonathan Israel, who's a historian of early modern European thought, especially political thought, and a great champion of what he calls the radical enlightenment, which basically means for him Benedict Spinoza, who is often regarded as an atheist. I think that's wrong, actually. It's not. Spinoza believed only in God, like he's a pantheist. Everything is God. He didn't think the world would be the better way of putting it.
Sure.
But anyway, so Spinoza, he was a very radical figure. He's Jewish, a philosopher, excommunicated kicked out of his synagogue in Amsterdam, and was, his writings were very, suppressed at various parts of his life, and he was quite a radical figure. But so there's another version of the story, which has elements of truth in it. It says that really the stuff that we care most about comes from these kind of deviant, marginal figures like Spinoza, gets picked up by later philosophers. Rousseau, say, who then influenced the French Revolution, and most of that is all secular. That's the idea. I mean, I think that's, and I do think it's important for me. Maybe this is a helpful thing to say. Like I mentioned before, that the first abolitionists, in the West were Quakers, right? I mean, Quakers were also persecuted, by other Christians for a lot of their history, right? And they were regarded as deviants and as heretics, and so it's not. I don't. I think it's. Christians often are over hasty in trying to take credit, like in an institutional sense, for having. Yeah. I mean, the biggest Christian institutions were often like the last people to come around to some of these developments.
Sure,
So
sure.
that doesn't mean that the developments in terms of their lineage, their genesis, were not in fact the products in a very important way of this very long germination of.
Sure.
And I think it's just on the topic of Spinoza, for instance. I mean, it's easy to underestimate, and I think Israel does underestimate the extent to which he's actually influenced in his own way by a very long history of medieval Jewish and Christian philosophy and theology. I mean, he doesn't cite them, but he's reading Aquinas, for instance, and knows a lot of Aquinas. And
Interesting.
so anyway, yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, I think all serious parties to the debate end up, recognizing that there's a lot of continuity and discontinuity, say, in this history, and it's questions where you place the accent, and I mean, so, but yeah, I mean, to my mind, no one should want. I mean, certainly no Christian should want to sort of like whitewash terrible things that the church has participated in.
No, I was going to say that there's obviously not a clean bill of health on that side either. Yeah, that's
By
right.
all means, yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, and I mean, certainly we have, yes. I mean, thinking again about Spinoza, I mean, the history of the weight of the church's sort of traditional anti-Semitism, weighs very, very heavily. I think, particularly, obviously, after the Holocaust, is something that the church incubated, at least in a pretty virulent way, for a very long time. So yeah, no, not a clean bill of health by any means. Yeah, in that regard, but nothing, in this Vale of Tears is all bad or all good, right? Everything is mixed in various ways. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brendan. Like, this has been, I don't know whether this has been useful for anyone that's interested in researching happiness. I hope that it has been. I can absolutely see how that's the case. So I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. I'm conscious of your time. I just have I have an unfair question and then a pretty fair question. My unfair question is just of my own curiosity. You've mentioned the Sermon on the Mount a few times, and I understand that there's some link between, like, so the Beatitudes, we don't have to go into this, people can look that up, but the Beatitudes and happiness, like, I think there's maybe like a Greek translation where it almost represents happiness in some way.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way. Can you point me in the direction of somewhere I can find more information on that? Because I'm not going to ask you to explain it.
Yeah. Yes. Get a very good, concise account of it in a book called The Sermon on the Mount and Human Flourishing by a New Testament scholar named Jonathan Pennington. He will have more information than you require about that. But yes, absolutely. The word in question, translated as blessed, is makarios. It's a word that Aristotle uses, actually, in the Nicomachean Ethics to describe the supremely happy. It's usually translated in Aristotle supremely blessed. It's even better than eudaimonia. It's the best kind of happiness.
Okay.
So yeah, very direct links. Yeah, certainly.
Fantastic. All right. Well, that's the perfect. Just judging by the title, that's the next book I'm going to read.
Yeah, good.
And so then my last question is really for people that are sort of have a budding interest in this field. I feel the same way about, obviously philosophy can feel inaccessible. What would you recommend in terms of a budding interest in theology?
Yeah. I mean, I do think in general, if you're just interested in trying to get a sense of like what Christians are on about, I think the New Testament's a pretty good place to start. I mean, the Gospel of John, if you haven't read it, is a pretty accessible text and has lots of interesting stuff in it. Put it that way. In terms of the history of Christian thought, it's hard to know exactly how to. I mean, there are trade-offs obviously between accessibility and depth. Right? And so it's like, to some extent, the more accessible it is, the less it will represent, kind of the best that's been thought and said in this field, right? So, which is to some extent, which is okay, I think. I mean, I don't know. This is biographical for me, I suppose, more than anything, but I do have a deep affection for the 20th century sort of Christian apologist, I guess you'd call him. Not quite a theologian, but a Christian author. Chesterton's awesome. I was thinking of C.S. Lewis.
Okay. Okay. Even better. Yeah.
Well, I quite like. I mean, I do think you could do worse. It's not a perfect book in any sense, but you could do worse than start with his book Mere Christianity if you wanted a kind of high level overview again of what Christians are on about. He was an Anglican, but had a pretty ecumenical sensibility in the sense of he wrote. It's called Mere Christianity because he was trying to write something that would have been acceptable to basically any Christians of any stripe, kind of common ground, and so, yeah, and that's a good way in. I mean, you could work your way back to, Augustine's fantastic to read, but the Confessions are a little forbidding, and, I've found, I've suggested that to people as a place to start, and they come back and they're like, I can't make anything of that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah,
Definitely.
I would say probably read the Gospel of John or read C.S. Lewis, and then see what you think, after that, if you want to go deeper. Yeah.
You'll find your way after that, I guess.
Yeah, Lewis, he references lots of books that you could use to orient yourself after that if you wanted, but yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much again. This has been just a delight, to be honest. It's been really enthralling just to hear this work and to know that it's happening in the world and at Harvard of all places.
Of all places.
So
Indeed.
yeah, no, really appreciate your time and thank you again.
All right. Well, thanks for the invitation, Matt. Yeah, and best of luck. Hope that we'll connect again at some point.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Okay.
Okay, a huge thank you to Dr. Brendan Case for joining us this week. I want to know what you're thinking. Like, let me know, please. Hit me up on Twitter or on LinkedIn, in the comments, whatever. Let me know because I want to do more of this and I want to hear what other people think. So, thank you again to Brendan. Enjoy. Don't forget to share this with someone who might be interested. Thank you.